Hello and welcome to the September 2021 podcast from Le Monde Diplomatique. My name's George Miller, and my guest this month is Jérôme Doyon, who's a fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center. Jérôme is a China specialist, and his article in this month's paper is entitled "What's Left of Communism in China?" The Chinese Communist Party, which currently has 95 million members, has changed almost beyond recognition since the time of Mao. So its 100th birthday, which falls this year, seems a good time to take stock of what it's become and what it stands for. What are its priorities? How does it maintain its control over Chinese society? And what's it planning to do about wealth disparities, which have become as acute in China as they are in the West? When I spoke to Jérôme recently, I started by asking him to sketch out a picture of the relationship between party and wider Chinese society.
I think a good way to think about it is a sort of, mix of control and cooptation, I guess, when you think about the relationship between the party and broader society. So, it's a party state, so the parties can be found at every sort of levels of the polity, fused with the state to a certain extent. Can also, it has units in basically all important institutions, companies, private ones, public ones, schools, social organizations, which is a sort of way to talk about Chinese NGOs. They're not NGOs because they're not non-governmental. So we talk about social organizations, and they're supposed to have a party unit as well. So I said control and cooptation. Of course, sort of pure control, pure repression still exist. And what we see in the western regions of China, for instance, with re-education camps and forced labor for populations that are seen as not cynicized enough, not loyal enough to the regime, as definitely extreme examples of that. But I think also what's interesting is that control is often more subtle, and this has been the case since the economic reforms initiated 40 years ago, basically, by Deng Xiaoping. For instance, we see a lot of, the party is providing a lot of venues for social engagements, for volunteering, for philanthropy to Chinese individuals, and often through channels directly or indirectly controlled by the party. So that, again, this sort of subtle form of control or cooptation. And the CCP also, so it's one of the biggest political organizations in the world. Membership is 95 million right now. And therefore, it basically uses this membership to co-opt millions of Chinese in its organization, make sure that they have a stake in the survival of the system. And now it largely focuses on recruiting individuals that it sees as being part of what it sees as the elite of China, so officials, executives, students, and so on. We see under Xi Jinping a tendency to extend party control over the state, over social organizations, over companies, and I think that's something we'll talk about further, but there's a sort of tendency to more party hegemony these days.
So you mentioned schools and youth organizations, so your experience as a Chinese person of the party begins really from the moment you enter the education system, or?
Yes, so the party has what it calls mass organizations, focus on basically recruiting young people. So you have the young pioneers that are for children. Almost all young children are part of it, and it's basically part of the school system and organizes extracurricular activities for children. Then when you become a teenager, you can decide to join the Communist Youth League. Pioneer is not really a choice. Youth League starts to be a choice because it's not all of them who are part of the Youth League. It's around actually 30% of the cohort. So it's for young people between 14 and 28 years old. So you're in middle school, high school, and you decide to join the Youth League. You have to be relatively, a decent student, being able to keep your head down. You're not creating any problem, and then you'll be recommended by the school administration, your teachers, and so on to become part of the Youth League. And then the question is, do you join the party after that? So that's when you're over 18. And so, as I mentioned, it's 95 million people now. So it's a lot of people. Those are not all, people who are paid by the party. They have a membership card, and they work in very different paths of life. It's the party state officials, the ones who work for the party and the state, are a different category. Most of them are party members, but not all party members work for the party and the state. Basically, you go from the pioneers to your youth league to then the party.
So those 95 million people, as you say, they come from different walks of life. But is it possible to sort of make some general observations about what kind of person today is attracted to becoming a member of the Chinese Communist Party, and what is the nature of that attraction? What is it that's leading those individuals to decide to become full members?
Yeah, it's both those who are attracted, who choose to apply, and also the ones who are selected, because all the ones that apply do not become party members. Actually, joining the youth league, for instance, is relatively easy. Again, if you're a decent student and relatively not creating problems at school, basically. But the party, there's a real selection process. You have to be recommended by other party members. You have to go through generally a couple of years of screening, basically going through training programs, and they will ask people around you about your political views, about your life, and so on. If we look at sort of a macro picture of party membership, something that's quite interesting is, since the Mao era, so in the past 50 years, is the decreasing numbers of workers and peasants, which is, those are supposed to be the revolutionary classes, the politically advanced classes that a communist party, a Maoist party is supposed to represent. And in the 60s, they represented around 75% of the membership. Now it's more, it's closer to 30. So they used to be the vast majority. Now they're a minority, and now they've been replaced by basically college-educated members. Those are party state officials, public sector employees more broadly, private sector executives, entrepreneurs, and so on. Over these 50 years, the Communist Party became basically a white-collar and elite party as the result of the economic reforms. But also, it's a choice on the party side to change its recruitment policy. And in the early 2000s, you have Jiang Zemin, who was heading the party and the state at the time, who called for the party to represent the whole nation and not the revolutionary classes only anymore. And especially to represent the advanced productive forces of the country, meaning executives, entrepreneurs, and so on. And as a result of this sort of change in recruitment policy, the CCP is not representing the revolutionary classes specifically, but the population more broadly. Then you asked about why the individuals themselves, they would, join the party, sort of the motivations to join. And with this change, moving toward an elitist party, we also see that the motivations, the incentive for joining the party, they have also changed. There are a lot of, reasons why one would join the party. But there's actually interesting survey data published by Bruce Dixon that shows that revolutionary ideology, the idea to work for communism, serve communism, is less and less of a pull factor. It was one of the main reasons to join the party during the Maoist era, so until the mid-70s. But when we ask people today why they join the party, generally they have much more pragmatic motivations, and one's basically professional advancement, finding a job and advancing in one's career, is often at the top of the list or close to the top of the list. You also have nationalist discourse around it, sort of. It's not about serving communism or working for communism anymore, but serving the country potentially. But the sort of professional aspect is also very important. And in fact, when you look at when people join the party, large amount of people join them when they are at university, just before they sort of join the job market, and in order to basically have more options on the job market. So it's basically a quasi prerequisite for a lot of public sector jobs to become an official, to work in a state-owned company, but it also can help to find a private job in the private sector. So it definitely can help job prospects.
Yeah, I was assuming that it would be a requirement of a public sector job, but I was wondering, whether it was also a requirement, really, if you wanted to thrive as a business owner, as an entrepreneur, if really you found doors were closed to you, if you were in some way suspect, if you weren't a member of the party.
So, I mean, if you create your own business, it's more, I guess, the party membership can be useful in terms of as a network, right? Because by becoming a member, you meet a lot of people that then can be, useful for your future sort of endeavor as an entrepreneur. For private sector employees, more generally, when they meet the sort of human resources people and they show their CV, being a party member can be, it's a good signal. It shows that, at university, you were a relatively good student because you've been selected. It shows that you didn't create any problem in the university, that you have, you keep your head down, you didn't organize any political protests. You're relatively obedient, basically, and also that you're relatively well connected in the university because, again, you need to be recommended by other party members, so you're able to sort of build these links. So it's good sign on one's CV, I guess, when they go on the job market.
And I was curious to know if, you sort of describe a party that's really losing its ideological origins or departing from its ideological origins. And I was curious whether it still has retained some of the sort of rhetorical superstructure of its communist origins, or if that too has sort of shifted. And I think you alluded earlier to the issue of nationalism. There's a slight tinge of it being a sort of nationalist rallying point, and clearly allegiance to the party brings all sorts of advantages. But to what extent is lip service still paid to its original ideology, and to what extent is that sort of being left behind entirely?
The ideological sort of rhetoric, sometimes, almost folklore with, tourists going to visit revolutionary bases and museums devoted to these issues is definitely very much present. And actually it's been revived to a certain extent under Xi Jinping. And there's a large debate about this with many sort of, experts of Chinese politics saying Xi Jinping as a new Mao, sort of reviving the revolutionary ideology. Xi Jinping is calling for party members, party officials to remember the original mission of the party, for instance. And I do not see Xi Jinping as a revolutionary, but rather as, mostly concerned about control. And I think in this context, the sort of revolutionary discourse or imagery is a useful way to sort of build on the party's revolutionary past to justify, to legitimize its current hold on power. And this goes actually alongside a nationalist discourse. And in fact, probably the organizational aspect is what is the most important now. It's control over the cadres, its members, its hegemony over society more broadly that I mentioned earlier. And in this context of, control over its own ranks in society, ideological discourse is also important. It's not only about legitimation, it's also about sort of creating what is called a party spirit among, officials and party members. They have to be, proud to be part of the party. They have to remember, again, its original mission. Personally, I tend to think of this party spirit as something close to a firm spirit. If you work for, Google or Amazon, you're supposed to be proud of it, which is not necessarily linked to a higher purpose, but rather focused on the success of the organization itself. And it goes, again, together with, your party spirit has to be trained, has to be cultivated, and that's what party members are supposed to do.
Can you say something about how it operates as a machine? It's clearly an effective machine. What kind of structure does it have? In such a vast country with such a vast population, you hear in news reports sometimes about, purges of corrupt local officials, and they're made an example of, or someone who seems to have, some local official who seems to have done something which has displeased a higher echelon of the party. So how do those interlocking levels of the party actually operate when it comes to its operations on the ground?
It's a very large organization, so it's also a complex one with basically different layers. And it's sort of very, hierarchical one as well. So basically, if you at the bottom, your party unit in a company or a school, you basically answer to the one to the leader of the unit one level up. So let's say you're, part of the unit of your department, literature department in a university. Then you would, answer to what the party committee of the university itself says. And then, this committee will answer to what the committee of maybe the city it's in, depending on, what type of university it is. So, you have this sort of, very clear hierarchy, and orders are supposed to follow. And that's what democratic centralism is largely is. So that's, the basis of a Leninist party. And it's supposed to be democratic because you should have discussions among party members, but it's centralism in the sense that once a decision is taken, you follow the orders that, come from the top. And the centralist element tends to often, trump the democratic one. Also, the party has its own disciplinary apparatus. And I think when you talk about corruption, anti-corruption, that's also what you have in mind. So it's sort of its own commissions and committees in charge of basically evaluating party members and evaluating their loyalty, their morality, and also when you're officials, to what extent you use your position for private gain, for instance.
In your article, Jérôme, you talk about an increasing level of involvement for the party in the workplace, not just in public workplaces, but also in the private sector. So that is something that the party is really extending at the moment, even to the extent of deciding or having influence on who gets hired or who gets promoted or who gets appointed.
It's a new trend, so we'll see exactly how it pans out. But I think it's a good example of a sort of more general trend of the sort of, extension of the party's reach, and including extension of the party's reach beyond its own membership. So I mentioned the sort of, internal sort of disciplinary apparatus of the party that's supposed to, manage party members and party officials. But under Xi Jinping, we see a tendency of sort of, this disciplinary apparatus to expand beyond its members through new institutions or through basically giving more importance to party units in private companies. So in the context of private companies, so not only we see more party units in companies, so more and more companies have to basically set up party units to organize the activities of the party members that, are present in the company. But also they have a more sort of important role. So it's not only about quantity, it's also about sort of quality of party penetration. Until now, party sales played a relatively minor role in companies. I think they mainly focused on recruiting party members, organized sort of training courses on, the party, its ideology, its policies for party members, as well as sort of, outside of work, sort of social and cultural activities, speed dating for party members, or, sort of welfare-oriented activities for employees. Now we see new guidelines started a couple of years ago, and the idea is to develop a modern enterprise system with Chinese characteristics. So I'm quoting here, that's the sort of overall motto. And that would imply CCP units in companies having sort of a supervisory role when it comes to human resources decisions in companies. So basically, CCP unit will have the power to greenlight or not recruiting and firing decision. And we will see exactly how this is implemented in practice. But it's interesting because it means that the party state can use the party organization to sort of extend its reach to partially sort of control or manipulate companies that are not state-owned. Of course, for state-owned companies, that's been the case for a long time, and that's a large part of the economy. But even in that case, fully private companies, then the party basically would have some say in management decisions, and that's quite new and at least an interesting development. Actually, now, if you're, for instance, a listed company in China, it's compulsory for you to have a party unit, for instance. So, companies of a certain size all have basically, or almost all of them have party units.
It sounds like a system that's ripe for corruption. It seems like if you've got to get your business decisions, your appointments approved, and you really want to do that badly, it seems like almost an invitation for corruption to enter. I know that corruption is found in all business systems, but it doesn't. China makes much of trying to eliminate corruption, doesn't it? And that seems a step potentially in the wrong direction.
I mean, it definitely creates, incentive for corruption for sure. And that's how, I mean, the system works to a certain extent. At the same time, you will have a lot of sort of monitoring and potentially disciplining of party members if they don't follow the rules. So that's sort of the, carrot and stick logic. But I mean, when you fight corruption, there are massive anti-corruption campaigns. A lot of people have been arrested. A lot of also higher level officials have been arrested. So there's definitely a willingness to fight against corruption. At the same time, when the disciplinary apparatus is part of the system itself, it's always tricky to solve the issue of basically who monitors the ones who discipline the others.
Yes.
So it's sort of, it's very hard to find a solution if you don't have a sort of external institution outside of the party that will sort of, serve as an anti-corruption institution.
Yes.
And that's not something, and it's not the sort of, control, the level of control that the party is ready to get rid of.
But I guess something we haven't talked about today is the role of technology, the role of surveillance, the degree to which Chinese people's day-to-day lives are monitored by the state. And I guess that is another aspect of the party's control over the people.
No, that's true. So the party state has sort of personal files on, everybody basically that, the personal files start to be filled when you are at school with, information about, how you're doing at school, views from your professors, so on. And then it follows you all your life, right? From, to university, to one job, another, and so on. And that's sort of the basic, way to, have information about people and control them. The question is to what extent this becomes digital now, and you have this sort of same information, maybe more, because then you have access about, what people are watching online, what they say online, and so on, in a sort of, digital version of this personal file. I mean, I'm really not a specialist of these issues. There are a lot of debate about, the extent or how this can be really implemented when we're talking about the social credit system. So, based on this sort of information, so you have a ranking of Chinese citizens are more or less loyal, more or less obedient, I guess, to regulations and to laws. My understanding is that it's very difficult to sort of put all the data together and sort of have a compulsory database that is useful. So, I mean, you have pilot programs in different cities, different organizations to sort of come up with this sort of, ranking of people that could then have an effect on, the sort of travel you're allowed to do, or the sort of, banking loans you could obtain, or that type of things. But I think my understanding is that we're still, a long way from a sort of Orwellian full-blown control, but that may be the direction.
And I guess the idea of it, even if the actuality of it hasn't arrived, the idea of it, once it's in people's heads, is quite potent, isn't it, as a means of self-control, potentially. If you think, your keystrokes might be monitored or whatever, then you maybe begin to be a little bit more careful and a bit more self-regulating. But it sounds from everything you've said today that the self-regulation is kind of built in from the thinking right from the time you go to school. As soon as you leave any kind of record of your life and your actions and your beliefs, then you have to be careful about what you're saying and what you're doing.
Of course. I mean, I guess 20 years ago, Perry Link, famous sinologist, to talk about self-censorship in China, he had this image of an anaconda in a chandelier. And the idea is, that there's big snake is always somewhere in the ceiling. It actually rarely bites, but, it can. And this leads to, yes, a certain degree of self-censorship, of course. I think this image is definitely still valid, and probably the anaconda gets bigger or even more threatening, has a longer reach in the age of data and digital technology.
Yeah, it's potentially a robot anaconda, which is quite scary. Jérôme, I just wanted to ask you one last thing today. I picked up a quote from President Xi from earlier this year. He said, "Achieving common prosperity is not just an economic issue, it's a major political matter bearing on the party's foundation for rule. We cannot let an unbridgeable gulf appear between the rich and the poor." And from your article, it's clear that gulf already exists. China has a significant number of billionaires, there's significant wealth, but there is also significant poverty. And I also noticed that internet giants such as Alibaba and Tencent had been making very big pledges towards common prosperity funded projects, which was clearly a sign that they were concerned about what might be afoot. So I just wanted to finish by asking you, what do you think Xi has in mind there? How far might he go? Because clearly he wants to ensure stability across the whole country, but these big companies are clearly engines of prosperity. So it's a delicate balance, isn't it? So how do you read how he might go from here?
I think it's quite interesting that we have this, push now under Xi Jinping for more redistribution. I mean, it's not new. I mean, under, his predecessor, Hu Jintao, he was talking about a harmonious society, and part of it was sort of, more basically social welfare for a large part of the population, and more redistribution to a certain extent as well. And I mean, I guess, it's a good thing, as in a very unequal society after 40 years of market reforms, to aim for more redistribution and equality. The question is, how to achieve it.
Yes.
And for now, we mostly see more control over companies, especially in the new technologies sector that you mentioned, but also the entertainment industry. And I mean, to cracking down on these sectors does not necessarily or really lead to more redistribution. So the question is, is it more about control, or is it as much about control as it is about redistribution? At the same time, there are some interesting initiatives to, facilitate access, for instance, to credits for smaller companies, loans for students, and so on. So we'll see exactly what happens in the future. What you mentioned about Alibaba and others, basically the idea is that philanthropy from companies seems to be a big part of this common prosperity agenda. Which is actually quite interesting, because coming back to this idea of, party units being more and more important in businesses, we can imagine that party units in these companies could have, a big say then in the amount of money we are talking about, or where the money goes exactly to what kind of projects. And this is a very different way to try to, redistribute than coming up with a major tax reform, for instance, yes, which is something that is probably very much needed in the Chinese case. We have a tax system largely based on value-added tax, privileging the rich. So introducing a property tax, for instance, would be definitely a good way to, go towards more redistribution. So is that the goal as well? I don't know. It's still unclear. It will be interesting to follow definitely. But for now, the sort of balance between control and redistribution, control seems to take a greater role now, but that may change in the future.
I guess a tax reform is a fairly blunt instrument, whereas using the party, which is in the sort of bloodstream of the nation, allows it to some discretion in how it decides, what it prioritizes, how it implements, how it, as you say, exerts control over these companies rather than simply imposing a tax on them. It maintains its influence within them.
Definitely, yeah. So will definitely increase party influence, party control. Also gives a certain level of flexibility in implementation. Basically, you have more say in where the money, or how much money goes and where, I guess. It gives more importance to the party versus the state, which will be the one, on the forefront in the case of a tax reform. At the same time, it's hard to imagine that any level of philanthropy could basically fulfill the same role as an overall tax reform. So if you really want to aim for common prosperity, for more distribution, then you have to choose the right tools, I guess.
Yes, and I guess they're not mutually exclusive, are they? They can work in tandem. I was speaking to Jérôme Doyon, who has an article entitled "What's Left of Communism in China?" in the September 2021 edition of Le Monde Diplomatique. You can read Jérôme's piece at mondediplo.com. And if you're a subscriber, you can also read every edition of the paper going back over 20 years, as well as exploring other resources, such as the podcast archive and online exclusive content. And if you're not yet a subscriber, there's plenty of content online to entice you to become one. In the words of John Berger, why read LMD? To make sense of what's happening in the world, behind the misinformation. I hope you'll join me again soon for another interview with one of our contributors. Until then, thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.
Thank you.